Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for the Ecodistricts Institute July webinar as part of our annual series. Today's webinar is going to be on restorative economics for people and the planet, and our presenter is Nwamaka Agbo. We're going to wait a couple minutes to get started until a few more people join us. So I'll check back in just a few minutes to get started with the webinar. Okay, I'm going to get started with the webinar. As I said, welcome to everybody who could join us. We are going to hear from our presenter in just a few minutes. First, I just wanted to quickly thank our Institute sponsor, Delos, for making these webinars possible. I'm quickly going to talk to you a little bit about how Ecodistricts works. So we are a national intermediary nonprofit. We are trying to set a standard for urban and community development, and we do this in two ways. Through building a community of practice, and that is through our certification, accreditation, trainings, and professional development, and then also by supporting cities and projects in the work that they do through providing technical assistance and other support. And this is primarily in under-resourced neighborhoods and communities. We are guided by the Ecodistricts protocol. And what we really see the protocol as is a roadmap to community benefits. So it integrates equity, resilience, and climate protection into the neighborhood planning and regeneration process. The 6 priority areas in the orange icons, if you are viewing the screen, are really how the strategies and the performance metrics that we suggest and we ask neighborhoods to integrate into their planning in order to see success. And then formation, roadmap, and performance are phases of implementation that can guide projects from beginning to actual implementation of projects and strategies.
Katie, I don't think the slide's on presentation mode. It's hard to see the... The icon at the bottom right next to the plus minus should put you in presentation mode.
Hold on one second. Can you see that now?
Yes, that's much better. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Sorry about that, everybody. So as I was saying, this is our protocol. I kind of just walked through it. The imperatives are at the top, the priorities are in the middle, and the implementation phases are at the bottom. So what we're really trying to do at the Institute is to bring in individuals who have expertise in different areas that are aligned with the work that we're doing in neighborhoods and really spotlight the work that practitioners are doing and the expertise that some of our partners have in different areas, which is why today you'll be hearing from Nwamaka and her work in restorative economics. So before I turn it over to Nwamaka, I just wanted to briefly talk about some upcoming events that we have as part of the Institute. We have bi-monthly webinars. So we have 2 more. We have one in September that's going to be about scaling up eco-districts. And it's focused on learning about the neighborhood approach that Pittsburgh is taking in multiple neighborhoods to really scale up their efforts and create real change in those neighborhoods. And then in November, we will be learning more about net zero districts and how neighborhoods and districts of different types and scales can get to net zero and get a lot of those, especially climate benefits that are necessary in today's day and age. And then we also provide in-person trainings if people are interested in learning more specifically about eco-districts and about the protocol in order to apply it in your work. So we have one coming up in St. Louis in September. We'll have one at our Eco-District Summit in Pittsburgh in November, and then we'll also hold one in Toronto, Canada in December. We have online foundation courses as well, and I'm happy to share more information about that in the follow-up email that you'll receive. And then this is just how you can engage with us if you're interested in learning more than beyond just this webinar. We have annual incubator trainings. We have a certification program for communities that are really interested in buying into the protocol from formation all the way through to when you're implementing your strategies and projects. We have, as I said, our accredited professional individual credential, which will help you become deeply embedded in using the protocol. And then we offer help as technical assistance on projects. And finally, we hold an annual conference called the Summit. And our conference this year is in Pittsburgh in November. And we have a really great program we're pulling together and would love for anybody interested in attending that. So you'll receive more information on all of that as well in the follow-up email. So briefly, I just want to introduce you to our presenter, Nwamaka Agbo. She is a restorative economics consultant with her own consulting company. Nwamaka has more than 10 years of experience in social justice, community organizing issues. She was formerly a fellow with the Movement Strategy Center in Oakland. She was also program director with Eco Districts, so she has been working with us for a long time, is a wonderful partner. She serves as a faculty member advising communities that we work with in many of our programs. And so, Nwamaka, I'm happy to turn it over to you now.
Great, thank you, Katie. So while Katie's switching over to presentation mode, let me make sure. Let me see if I can switch the screen. Sorry, give me 1 second. Let me turn this back around because I'm showing the wrong slides up here.
And while we're waiting for Nwamaka to pull up her slides, I wanted to say to all attendees that this is being recorded, so I will distribute it after the end of the webinar. And if you have any questions as Nwamaka is talking, or if you have any questions for me, there's a questions box that you should be able to see in your GoToWebinar control panel if you're using your computer. And so I will be monitoring those questions, and then we will have a question and answer period at the end of Nwamaka's presentation.
Great. Thank you, Katie. Sorry, I had to switch my double screens around. So yes, everybody, thank you for making the time to come and participate in this webinar. I'm always honored when I have an opportunity to be with the Eco Districts family. By way of background, in addition to some of the comments that Katie shared earlier, I thought it'd be helpful to kind of open up with a brief story about why I kind of got into this work around restorative economics, to also kind of help illiterate then why I decided to create a framework to base my consulting practice on. So as was mentioned, I come from a long-term social racial justice organizing background, particularly based in the Bay Area, but I have also worked on national policies and projects. And one of the things I experienced during my time working at the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights during the Green Collar Jobs campaign was that we spend a lot of time turning out community members, community organizers to kind of show up and make their voices heard at city council meetings, to really kind of push back against the forces that are shaping their communities. And oftentimes this can lead to a significant amount of fatigue for community members that are actually dealing with some very urgent, immediate crises impacting their families and their communities. And so there's an opportunity for us to really think about, particularly for those of us that do community organizing, how we're not only just engaging community members to kind of push back against those forces impacting our communities, but how are we actually bringing them together to really start to articulate a vision for what they want for their communities, and then providing them with the skills and capacities to actively build and implement that vision. And I think that's one of the places where Eco Districts does really well with the communities that it supports through not only through the incubator program, but previously through target cities. I think the other piece of what I experienced as being an early community organizer, particularly when I worked on green collar jobs policy in Sacramento, was that while we spent a lot of time building cross-sector coalitions, trying to craft a really progressive policy that focused on creating quality green jobs with a pathway out of poverty, that oftentimes the policies that we were negotiating, a lot of the decisions had actually been made ahead of time. And they're oftentimes made in back rooms with deals with developers and with lobbyists that engaged around the negotiations around how we finance particular policies. And so these conversations that are related to money and how we invest in communities, not only are they not transparent and accessible to communities on the ground, but even if communities were to have access to those conversations, those rooms, they oftentimes don't have the financial literacy or the skills to meaningfully engage in those conversations. And so that's what kind of led me on a personal journey to learn more about the emerging impact investing field, particularly as we started to see more foundations lean towards program-related investments and mission-related investments as products that they were now making available to communities. And so I've spent some time kind of looking into finance, economy, and capital, and what it means for those of us that are struggling and fighting for social and racial justice. And so to kind of start us off, I think one of the things I really wanted to lift up is just providing some framing context about where we're currently at. We currently are engaged in a dominant economic model that's rooted in the extraction of natural resources, the exploitation of people's labor, the consolidation of control and power, along with the accumulation of wealth within a fewer wealthier minority of people, and then policies that are really focused on excluding particular individuals from being able to participate in a lot of the benefits that our economy has to offer. And so our work is to start to figure out, how do we start to lift up the values and practices that make it possible for us to engage in a just transition towards a more equitable and sustainable economy, particularly policies and practices and values that are very much rooted in regeneration of the planet, regeneration of relationships, starting to really rethink and reclaim our democracy around one that really focuses in on centering the needs of impacted communities, around governing for the whole, and starting to move towards a model of shared prosperity as opposed to one that's really focused in a model of individualism and individual wealth. And then starting to also think about policies that help to create more inclusion so that everybody can kind of benefit, can enjoy a lot of the benefits of our economy. And with this is an opportunity to also rethink how we define economy, essentially. So our current old paradigm around economy is one in which, when I think of economy, I think very much to what I studied in my graduate studies economics courses. We looked at elasticity. It was very much about the supply and demand curve. Everything was very much rooted in dollars and cents. But one of the things that an organization called Movement Generation has really lifted up for me is that the etymology of the word economy is actually the management of home. And so when I start to think about what home means to me, home actually means to me, it's about my friends, my families, my culture, my traditions, those that I care about and how I want to be in deep and right relationship with them. And so this is an opportunity to think about how do we not only start to rethink, redefine our understanding of our economy, but start to lift up the values, the practices, and tools that bring us deeper into alignment with the truth of the word, which is the management of home. This other piece around the work that I do is very much focused in on who gets to make decisions. One of the things I'm oftentimes very clear about is that the decision makers around how investments are coming into particular communities oftentimes sit outside of those communities that are most directly impacted by their investment decisions, by the actual development projects. And so our work is an opportunity to figure out how we start to bring those that stand to be most directly impacted by a project. How do you make it possible for them to have direct decision-making authority over what is happening in their community, and also being able to engage in and experiencing a lot of the benefits of what that development project may have to offer. And so all of this kind of brings me to why I decided to really start to build out a framework called Restorative Economics that's actually very much focused in on the projects that I've been supporting over the last some years. One of the things I would note is that for me, restorative economics sits within an emerging framework of movement that is happening around people who are referring to this work as just transition. There's a growing solidarity economy movement in the global South that's led by women of color. And then we've also recently seen the new economy movement as well taking off in the United States. I offer restorative economics as a helpful intervention point for us to actually take a moment to pause and think about who is most directly impacted as we start to really think about how we restructure our economy. One of the things I've experienced in the growing new economy movement is that those that are have the leisure time, the risk tolerance, and the flexible capital are those that are then able to take some risks in innovating with cooperative models and sharing economies and other business models. But unfortunately, those individuals that have the leisure time, the flexible capital, and risk tolerance also tend to be those that are wealthier and wider. And so we tend to see those that have already had access to wealth and resources continuing to receive more resources to then create our more equitable new economy. And they oftentimes don't bring the deep race, class, and gender analysis that we want to have when we're trying to create a more equitable economy. And so restorative economics is an opportunity for us to pause and think strategically about who is receiving the direct investments into communities and ensure that those that have been most impacted by our extractive economy, those that have been excluded from participating in the benefits of it, are restored and then actually given an opportunity to have the skills and the ability to be a part of the conversation and how we're actually creating an equitable economy going forward. Anything less than that serves to then deepen the racial wealth divide and does not actually get us to a place where we have more equity and justice overall. And so the theory of liberation, the theory of change I work within is first really being able to lift up projects that are rooted in a commitment to community stewardship over assets and resources. Assets may look like a community governed fund. In the case of democratizing Capital East Bay, resources may look like land. They may look like community land trust, like we've seen with the Oakland Community Land Trust or the Black Land and Power work happening in the Southeast United States. Community stewardship is an opportunity for us to once again think about how we lift up models of shared prosperity that start to actually counteract our economic model of really focusing in on individual riches. Right now we have an economy that's very much rooted in, one individual gets their car, gets their house, they may share that with their family, but we are not thinking about what are the inputs that create for a vibrant, healthy, thriving community. And so this is an opportunity for us to start to look at what does stewardship over our natural resources, being energy infrastructure, broadband, internet infrastructure, water, land, start to look like. The other key piece of this is then figuring out, once again, how are we coming together to make the decisions about how we use these resources and assets together. I think in a time where we kind of see our democracies under attack with laws like Citizens United, we continue to see voter suppression tactics, we have an opportunity to actually reclaim democracy from being just something that happens every 4 years when we turn out to vote in elections, to actually being about the active daily stewardship over how our community is cared for, and caring for the people that live in that community. And so with that, my work is not just about bringing more people together to own more things together. While I think that is a helpful starting place, it's really recognizing that in our effort to create self-determination and shared prosperity, there's the opportunity to then leverage these specific assets that we're collectively building in a community and use them to advance the political, cultural, and economic power of those community members that have been most disenfranchised and most impacted. And so for me, the work is very much linked to, beyond just the actual development work that we're doing, how are we starting to build power for those that have oftentimes had to go without? And so the place that I typically try to start with the projects that I engage with is, where is the place where we need to actually engage in some repair and healing for the harm that has been done to these communities? Oftentimes, the reason we have the status quo and how we do development and how we share resources around society is because there's particular habits and patterns that we just default to. And once again, these habits and patterns being around exclusion, extraction, and exploitation. And so restorative economics provides an opportunity for us to have an intervention and to be very intentional about what are the embodied practices that we want to take on when doing a specific development project that allows us to actually live into something that is more regenerative and more transformative for the community. Financing a project, the financing of a project ends up bringing up particular issues in communities. And this is oftentimes because the communities that we are seeking to resource and finance, or at least the ones I work with, low-income communities of color, oftentimes don't have access to particular resources. And so when we start to engage in conversations around how to move money and how to apply money and prioritize development projects, we may see a particular response from a community that is in response to the trauma that they've experienced. Oftentimes communities that don't have access to the resources that they need to meet what they feel as their needs for safety and security will oftentimes kind of push back out of fear and out of response to the trauma that they've experienced from past development projects. So there's an opportunity for us to think about how our development projects also an opportunity to shift the culture around how development is done, and one that allows us to engage not only in the structural changes of a community, but through the development of a project, start to really lift up the opportunities for individual, interpersonal, and even intergroup transformation, and understanding that transformation takes place at all of these different levels within a community. And so once again, how do we start to actually name the healing that can be facilitated through a project that we're starting to engage in? Another piece of the work that I just want to emphasize once again is the opportunity for deep democracy. A model that I've been playing with the projects that I support is one called Governing for the Whole. Governing for the Whole is a horrible tagline. I know I need to figure out how to rebrand that. But essentially what Governing for the Whole does is lift up the opportunity to actually support a project in identifying who is the population that stands to be most directly impacted by this particular development project. And how do we make a decision that centers their needs, their interests, and their voices when possible around how that project happens, and do that with the understanding that when we make a decision that centers the needs of impacted populations, the chances are we're making decisions that then make their family and friends, the rest of their community, better off as a whole. Angela Glover Blackwell, the founder of PolicyLink, describes this a bit better. She calls it the curb cut effect. The curb cut effect essentially refers to the fact that when the American Disabilities Act was passed, one of the first things that happened was that cities started to cut the curbs out of sidewalks. They cut the curbs out of sidewalks to make it more accessible to those who were using wheelchairs. However, when they did this, they also then made the sidewalks more accessible to children pushing bicycles. They made it more accessible to parents who were pushing strollers. Anybody who wanted to access that sidewalk, now they had an easier time getting onto it. And so how can we start to think about the rest of the policies that we move in a particular community, or the ways that we do development projects, as one in which we're trying to cut the curbs, right, by centering the needs of the most impacted population. Another piece that I think is key to deep democracy when we do our work, and this is a tool that I actually learned from my time at eco districts, is this collaborative governance model that's really lifted up by Twyford's. And so a governance structure that actually brings us together with using a tool like the Declaration of Cooperation that engages us cross-sector stakeholders in a commitment to collaborate, and then moves them together through a process to really identify the problem and lift up the solutions, and then start to implement that project together. This is not only an opportunity to kind of break barriers and bring together different sectors of society, but it's an opportunity to also think about how we create solutions that are holistic and truly transformative. An example I would give of this is I live in the deep east neighborhood of Oakland. And, sometimes people, when they're driving around my neighborhood, driving around my community, they can be quick to judge and say that this is a community that dumps garbage, that doesn't actually care about where they're living or how they're living. And that from someone from an outside perspective could make that assessment. And the reality is, for the people that actually live in Oakland, we actually have people that come in and dump in our neighborhoods because our neighborhoods aren't as regulated or maintained as other wealthier neighborhoods. And so this is an opportunity to bring together people that both live in the neighborhood and those that are passing by and making external assumptions about what's happening there, to get to the root causes of what the problems are, so that we can then enact solutions that are truly transformative for that local community. And so, yes, I find the collaborative governance tool that we use at eco districts has been extremely helpful in my work in restorative economics. And then once again, the other piece of the work is about how are we using these projects to then build power and voice for those that have been most impacted. And so I tend to think of power as sitting in three spheres. The first sphere really looks at cultural power. Cultural power, once again, speaks to the values and practices of our society. Economic power really lifts up how those values and practices are then operationalized in the flow and goods of services, both within businesses, but around the community, and particularly the flow and goods of capital, and where money is being moved to and how that money is being moved. And then political power speaks to our ability to then actually memorialize and uphold those practices and values that can be easily defended in the court of law, right? So what are the actual policies that then get legislated that allow us to then scale how these policies and practices are used from a community to a community? And so this is an opportunity to think about how we start to move the traditional ways that we've engaged in the different realms of power around extraction and exploitation, control and accumulation, and start to actually embed practices that actually sit within the values that we want to live into. So an example I would take of how to use this tool is if we were to look at a value of extraction, for example, right? Extraction kind of being a cultural value or the cultural power that a community may have. How extraction could show up in an economic model is that we may actually have businesses that think that it's actually okay to steal wages from workers. Right? We may actually have businesses that feel fine with forcing people to work overtime and not properly compensate them. This is how we can see kind of the extraction of labor and as well as the exploitation of people's labor and capacity. And then what this ends up looking like on the political front in terms of what policies we see that continue to reinforce this value is that we may see a right to work state. a right to work state that undermines the ability for workers to come together, to collectivize their power, to assert their right to be properly paid for the work that they have provided for the company. Right? And so this is how we can start to see how cultural, economic, political power continue to play upon one another. If we actually wanted to start to live into some of our values for a more equitable economy, we could look at the value of inclusion, right? Inclusion as a cultural value, and what inclusion may look like on an economic power building front is that there is a project called the Buen Vivir Fund. This is a project of the Thousand Currents. Thousand Currents is a public foundation. And the Buen Vivir Fund is an integrated capital investment fund that looks at, that is structured so that it can actually not only receive investments from high net worth individuals, but it can also receive investments from non-accredited investors. And so up until recently, our country has been one in which, unless you're a high net worth individual that makes $250,000 a year, or you have a net worth of $2 million in assets, unless you meet those markers, you would not be able to invest in a project. So you would not actually be able to invest in your local business. But now we actually are starting to have projects where non-accredited investors, individuals that come in below those thresholds, can actually start to make investments into projects. And so the direct public offering is a tool that organizations like People's Community Marketplace in West Oakland have used to actually raise money from community investors, starting at $50 for a share, to help the creation of a cooperative, help the creation of a grocery store. What this looks like, once again, on the political power front is that we've had a number of different projects where people have wanted to raise investment capital from their local community. And then this led them to actually being able to pass a policy on the federal level that changed the securities exchange law that now allows people who are non-accredited investors to also kind of engage in investing in their local businesses. And so I think it's important for us to see ourselves not only as people that are kind of doing economic development projects and building economic power in communities, but to also recognize the interplay of what's happening on the political frontier, as well as what we're reinforcing culturally through how we develop and create our projects. And then the other piece is that as we start to think about moving from an economic model of extraction and accumulation and towards redistribution of wealth and resources, that the conversation we are essentially having is really one about redistributing power. Are we actually committed to ensuring that low-income communities of color have the power, the say and authority that they need to be able to exercise self-determination over their livelihoods? And that with that, there are a number of social movements that are on the ground that actually make it possible for us to now have conversations about how we do equitable development, how we actually need to engage communities in the master planning process and determining how we prioritize what gets developed and how it gets developed. One of the reasons I think it's important for us to really have our work rooted in social movements is that social movements are oftentimes at the cutting edge and the forefront of shifting and changing policies that allow us to live deeper into our values around equity and justice. And so one of the things I often try to lift up to people is that, for example, I'm fortunate enough to work with some businesses that are committed to actually hiring formerly incarcerated individuals within their businesses. So ensuring that people who are returning citizens back to their community can have access to dignified work. And hiring formerly incarcerated individuals does not do anything to address the problems around mass incarceration that disproportionately impacts Black and Brown communities in the United States. We actually need social movements on the ground that are continuing to push for the systemic change that needs to happen, that then allows us to engage in these specific projects in place in community to enact those changes that we want to see. And so there's an opportunity for us to think about how we engage social movements, not only as those who should come out and participate in town halls or community charrettes, but how are we directly working with them to understand the policies that they're trying to shift and how those policies and the economic development work that we're doing continue to feed off of one another. And so yes, this is the work that I do. I really try to support projects that are rooted in a community stewardship and community governance model. And so I wanted to quickly hit on some principles around restorative economics, particularly those principles that really lift up the importance of engaging in non-extractive integrated capital. Integrated capital speaks to the importance of looking at a particular project and recognizing that there are, through the development of a project, from the pre-development to the development and to the closeout stage, that there's a place for grant-making dollars that help to build the capacity of low-income communities of color and do the pre-development work that needs to happen to due diligence a project, and that may also be long-term patient capital. And then within that, as we're actually financing a project, how are we really interrogating the terms of that deal, the interest rate that the developer is looking at, who is recouping that interest rate, how is it going back into serving the community. I would also then just love to lift up the importance of engaging in values-aligned technical assistance providers, those lawyers, the contractors, the public sector agencies that we also bring in to support a project, and ensuring that they are culturally competent in how they're engaging with the local community and are actually doing their work from a values-led stance. And then once again, the importance of being able to establish the movement building strategy that continues to build the economic, political, and cultural power of a particular community in place. And so I'm quickly going to kind of go over a case study of one project that I've been working on for the past few years. We started in 2015 and use it as an opportunity to actually start to pull out what restorative economics can look like in application. So to provide some context, Restore Oakland is a project that I've been working on since 2015. It's based in the Fruitville neighborhood of East Oakland, and as many of you probably know, development in the Bay Area is extremely impacted. And so with that, two organizations, the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights, which works to address mass incarceration on the national level, and the Restaurant Opportunity Centers United, an organization that works to address the plight of workers in the low-wage restaurant industry, have come together to actually really take a close look at this problem of mass incarceration and economic inequality in our communities, and really looking at closely, particularly in the Bay Area, the fact that the restaurant industry is the fastest growing industry in the Bay Area. Workers in the restaurant industry, particularly those in the front of the house who are in serving positions, can make upwards of 6 figures in their job. And so when we think about communities that are impacted by displacement and gentrification, having access to a good quality job can actually be the difference between being able to stay in your home in East Oakland or having to actually move out more inland into the valley. The other piece that really kind of helped to link these two organizations together is the fact that the restaurant industry is also the #1 employer of formerly incarcerated individuals. So when we also look at this problem of mass incarceration that disproportionately impacts low-income communities of color, particularly those that are Black and brown, the restaurant industry can actually be a critical shift in ensuring that those that come back home don't actually recidivate into crime, because they have access to the economic supports that they need to be successful when they return back to their community. And so Restore Oakland is a development project located in the Fruitville neighborhood of East Oakland. It's a 3-level development project where on the right-hand side, you can see this image. The building will provide restorative justice programs for youth in the Oakland Unified School District. Restorative justice being a program that diverts people out of the school to prison pipeline and instead engages young people in coming together with those that have created harm and those that have been the victim of harm to resolve a conflict through a process that's committed to acknowledging the hurt and harm of the victim and creating accountability for those that have been harmed without then throwing our young people away and into the prison system. And so we work closely with the developer, Restorative Justice, or Designing Justice, Designing Spaces, that design spaces specifically to hold restorative justice programs, and then brought together the young people to actually talk about the look, the feel, and the design of this space. And so this is a program that will be happening on the upper level of the building in Restore Oakland. On the ground floor is where we will actually have our restaurant training program. The restaurant will both function as a fully functioning restaurant. Restaurant Opportunity Centers United runs restaurants both in New York, Michigan, and now in Oakland when the restaurant opens this September. But it also uses the restaurant industry as an opportunity to train people to get those good quality jobs in the restaurant industry, and then helps to place workers that graduate from their program into other high-wage restaurants that are also committed to providing good quality jobs to their workers. And then on the right-hand side, you can see this space will then also be a home to a number of social justice organizations, including the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights, Causa Justa Just Cause, that works to address tenant issues related to gentrification and displacement. And then on the bottom floor in the basement, we'll actually have access to large meeting room spaces for organizations to come meet with their membership. As individuals are being displaced out of the Bay Area, so are the organizations that serve them. So many organizations have gone to working remotely, but every now and again, they do actually need space to come together and meet with their members and meet with their staff. And so being able to offer them meeting rooms in the basement as spaces for people to come together. I'm going to move quickly just so we can make sure we get to our Q&A. One of the things I really wanted to touch on for this project was the integrated capital stack of how we funded it. Restore Oakland ended up being a multi-million-dollar project, both because it took a significant amount of time. Since we started in 2015, we purchased the building in 2016, we broke ground on construction in 2018, and then we just moved our tenants in to the building this past May. And so not only, as we know in development, time is money, but then along the way, given that development is so impacted in the Bay Area, that also made it just significantly more expensive to do this project. And so to launch the project in 2015, we were fortunate enough to receive some seed funding from the San Francisco Foundation and Google.org. These grants are what made it possible for the Ella Baker Center and Rock United to then hire me as a project manager and start to due diligence on this project, which then went into identifying the site and starting to figure out how to bring together the consultants and contractors that we would work with. We were fortunate enough to receive, to secure a building loan from a local CDFI, formerly known as the Northern California Community Loan Fund, now known as Community Vision. What was really wonderful about working with this CDFI is that they actually worked with me to really be intentional and restructure the terms of the loan to actually meet the needs of the Ella Baker Center and Rock United that were then taking on the debt to purchase the building and finance the project. And so being able to actually work closely with a financial partner that actually wants to see the project succeed and does not actually want to be extractive, but wants to help ensure that while we're also being financially accountable to our communities, that we're also then able to fund and finance the project that we decided to create. We also then worked closely with the Northern California Community Loan Fund to secure roughly $4 million in equity investments from new market tax credits. The new market tax credit process, I would say, was much needed equity injection into the project. And as many of you also probably know, tax credits are an extremely complex form of financing. So it took us quite some time to figure out how to structure this deal, given the fact that we had two organizations that had to be structured into the deal. And so it just took us time, capacity, and we actually had to learn a lot in a short amount of time about what this tax credit would then mean for the 501c3 organizations that would be responsible for stewarding the project and the resources. And then Northern California Community Loan Fund came in back again with a bridge loan to actually close us out for our new market tax credit deal. And then we currently have a capital campaign that we're looking to conclude at the end of this year that will be designed to actually help us in paying back the bridge loan and closing out the deal. So this is how we kind of look at integrated capital in the projects that I support, really trying to ensure that we have the early seed funding upfront in the grant capital and the long-term patient capital that allows us to develop the capacity to form the right team of values-aligned technical assistance providers that can then work with us to really structure the specific terms of a deal to meet the needs of the project within the carrying capacity, the financial carrying capacity of the projects that we're working with. And so I would just seek to leave with some questions that we get to think about as we do development projects, particularly who's benefiting the project, right? How are we actually ensuring that low-income communities of color aren't unduly taking on the disproportionate risks of a project? How are we actually looking at who is receiving the financial returns and how much of those financial returns are actually being reinvested back into the community? Once again, who is making the decisions? Making the decisions not only at the start of the project, but as the project is managed over time. I think one of the things Eco Districts really lifts up is the importance of having an ongoing governance structure to ensure that as we develop projects over a 10 to 20-year period, that there is a governing body that helps to ensure that the project continues to be managed with the original design and intent as it made sense. And then being able to take a critical look at who else is being impacted by this project, and not just the who, but the what. What do our development practices mean for the planet, and how can we start to actually look for some of those unintended consequences and try to enact practices that help to mitigate any hurt that can result from this project. And so yes, I think this last slide just kind of helps to kind of underscore how we can start to think about a development project, not only as the financial returns, but the human and natural returns that we start to receive when we invest in a community, really lifting up the importance to seek out social movements as our partners that help us to also think about how we're continuing to deepen the equitable pieces of a community. And then, so I think all of this, I hope, can kind of be helpful food for thought. And yes, I look forward to your questions and engaging with you.
Thanks so much, Nwamaka. I wanted to open up to questions. We've had a couple so far, and everybody else, please feel free to type your questions in the questions pane of your GoToWebinar control panel. The first question we got, Nwamaka, is what is your theory of action regarding implementing a functional shift to a new, more equitable economy?
Oh, theory of action. Yeah, I think the piece around a theory of action, on one hand, I think the question speaks to the urgency of the times that we're in, and I think we have an opportunity to think about what is the long-term arc of the change that we're trying to create and shift. And so the theory of action that I sit within is how are we actually developing the capacity and skills of a community to engage in a meaningful way in a project. An example I oftentimes like to share with people is that there was a worker-owned cooperative grocery store in West Oakland called Mandela Foods Cooperative. And one of the things Dana Harvey, the founder of that project, oftentimes shares is that the hardest piece of the project wasn't just securing the storefront and securing the capital, but it actually took a significant amount of time to work with a population that had been generationally unemployed. So for those of you that don't know, West Oakland is a community that has experienced significant disinvestment, has not had access to a grocery store in a number of years. And so to take a population that has not had access to good quality jobs and now try to actually engage them as a worker owner was a stretch, right? Because they don't actually have the skill sets. There's time for healing and shift that needs to happen there. So really being able to engage think about a project not only as the built environment, but what is also the human development and capacity building that needs to happen so that community members actually have the skill sets to respond to a lot of the benefits, but a lot of the challenges that we will likely seek to experience, particularly knowing that communities of color are hit first and worst by climate change. And so my theory of action really sits within this piece of making sure that we are going in and securing the long-term patient capital that makes it possible for us to engage and support people in participating in a project for the long term, and not just one specific building that will be developed in 24 months. I try to look at transformation as an arc over a period of time that's very much rooted in relationships.
Great, thank you. Another question we got is if you could give any insight into additional resources that are available about integrated capital stacking specifically and the financing of these projects, or if you could give participants or people, point them to where they can start looking for this information and how to learn more.
Sure. So RSF Social Finance is an institution based in San Francisco that is has helped to popularize integrated capital, both as a practice for investments and has actually worked to actually engage with donors and investors that want to participate in an integrated capital deal. And so I would definitely point people towards RSF Social Finance. They also, a couple of years ago, launched their Integrated Capital Institute. I participated in cohort 1. And so this was an opportunity to also bring together people that engage in the field of impact investing, grant making, to also come together to figure out how do we start to be more intentional about how we structure deals to make sure that they're non-extractive. So I would definitely point folks towards RSF Social Finance in San Francisco.
Great, thank you. Another question, is there an opportunity to apply restorative economics retroactively? So this person understands the importance of it as a strategy for new equitable development, but can it be applied to past projects and how?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, I don't see why it couldn't be applied to past projects. And I would say, I think some of the conditions for that to happen would be actually identifying what are the places where things can be shifted. So for example, if we've already developed Restore Oakland, and now we want to go back to the community, how do we start to identify, even though we already have the building, what is that ongoing governance and management structure of that building look like? How is it engaging in relationship to community? So I would offer those projects that are willing and interested in engaging in some of those questions that are kind of forward-looking around development projects, around the engagement of local neighborhoods. I think it would be beautiful to kind of apply restorative economics retroactively in that way. And I would also lift up that on the healing front, the ability to actually also engage use a circle practice as a way of how we kind of engage in practices of deep democracy, but also kind of in surfacing, and even just a lot stands to be gained from even acknowledging where we may fail and harm people, right? Even the acknowledgement goes a long way. And so if there's a project that happened that had an adverse impact on a community, is there an opportunity to actually come together and acknowledge what could have been done better? I would offer that it's also critical, though, to be in commitment with naming, well, what will we change next time? And the commitment to actually doing things differently in the future. I would caution us not to kind of engage in lip service to communities, but if we are really focused and committed and improving and growing, I do think the practices of restorative economics can be applied when we look at building power, the governance of a project, and then the healing that needs to happen in a particular place.
Mm-hmm. Okay, our next question is, this individual is curious if you have advice about how to set up local investment that allows non-accredited investors. For example, what are some good models of mostly crowdfunding driven projects or other types of community investment pools?
Yeah, that's another great question. So, Democratizing Capital East Bay is a project that was supported by the Solidago Foundation. It's a project based in the East Bay of California. I don't think we have a website yet, but this is a project that looked at structuring a fund that had different tranches of investment. So, a tranche of investment that allows people to raise money from community investors, another tranche of investment that allows impact investors, particularly those that are willing to engage in below market rate returns or even negative returns as another tranche. And then also being able to then set up what's called kind of the loan loss guarantee fund. The loan loss guarantee fund is oftentimes capitalized by philanthropy or those long-term negative return investors that are willing to take a loss on their returns to ensure that those community investors actually get their returns instead. And so I would say some funds to research and look into would definitely be Democratizing Capital East Bay. The Working World, particularly their Seed Commons initiative, is a national network of place-based community loan funds. So that would also be an interesting model to kind of research around how they're also structuring their funds and creating opportunities to raise money from community investors. And then the mechanism that I specifically referring to for community investments is oftentimes called a direct public offering. And Cutting Edge Capital is a firm that has really helped to support communities in structuring their direct public offering deal so that they can go and raise money from community investors. But yes, there are a number of community governed funds that are starting to pop up across the country that are trying to figure out how to raise money from community investors. I will say that raising money from community investors takes a significant amount of time because we're not having kind of that one lump sum of $100,000 coming in. Instead, we're trying to organize and mobilize a community of 200 individuals that can then turn out $50 each. So it takes a good amount of time, which has implications for capacity. And has implications for the level of relationship that currently exists within a community as well. So being able to kind of combine a community investment strategy with a community organizing strategy is where I've seen these projects be most successful in raising funds.
Great, thanks. We have two more quick questions. The first is, what are the most common hurdles, maybe one or two, that you face to get people with capital, power, and influence to engage with communities in restorative financing?
Yeah, so I think it's another good question. I think the biggest challenge is that even those that have access to wealth and resources are also experiencing their own traumas. And so when they have been taught that they actually need to engage in market rate returns, that they need to kind of accumulate and grow their wealth as much as possible, it can be hard to have an individual like me come and say and really challenge them on the terms of which they're looking to invest. So I think our economy is structured to always look at extracting profit at the expense of people in the planet. I think those are some of the challenges, and I think as individuals, it can be scary to really engage in a conversation where we're being asked to relinquish our power, something that we have been taught that makes us safe and secure, so that others can have access to their own sense of safety and security. And so I think that those things are indoctrinated and institutionalized just as a product of how we live as a society and our economy has been structured. What I have found to break through that, though, has been the opportunities to actually bring investors together directly with those that they seek to invest in and support. And so on this piece, I would once again lift up the Buen Vivir Fund of Thousand Currents. The Buen Vivir Fund, before it launched, it actually brought together a set of potential investors, a set of potential funders with their grantees and their partners in the Global South to come together in a place of relationship building, a way of creating shared understanding, to then be able to really challenge and rethink how we structure investments that we want to make into communities, and really to push back against this notion of market rate returns, this notion of collateral, and the notion of cumbersome conditions that then continue to deepen and widen the racial wealth divide.
Okay, last question, since we're almost at time, is if people are interested in learning more about restorative economics and the work that you do, how can they learn more or get a hold of you?
Good question. So I think my website is kind of the best way to learn more and get a hold of me. My website is nwamakaagbo.com. I'm in the process of kind of starting to write a bit more and share more of my thoughts and learning experiences through my website, so stay tuned for that. And then with that, yes, I think there's a form where you can contact me, or you can email me at nwamaka@nwamakaagbo.com. And I'm based in Oakland, so if you happen to live in Oakland, I would always be happy to meet up for coffee.
Awesome, thanks, Nwamaka. We didn't get a chance to get to quite all of the questions, so if anybody feels like they really want an answer, please send me an email. My email address will be in the follow-up email you get from this webinar. You can always reach out to me and we can set up another conversation. In the meantime, you will receive that follow-up email with a certificate and a recording of this webinar in about an hour. So thank you, Nwamaka, so much for taking the time. Hope everybody enjoyed it and has a great day.